Hello, everybody. About 8 months ago, we had a great show with the BBC's former man in Washington, D.C., Nick Bryant. His latest book, The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself, predicted some of the stuff that's happening in the United States now. And some of it, I think, even Nick wouldn't have imagined. When you look at the headlines this week about the U.S.-Russia relationship changing in a head-spinning way, the U.S. and Russia ending apparently laying the groundwork for ending the Ukrainian war, all sorts of different relations, and of course tariffs and many other things in this new regime, if that's the right word. Nick is joining us from Sydney, Australia, where he now lives. Nick, do you miss America?
Well, look, I covered the first Trump administration, and Andrew always said it wasn't a kind of 24/7 job. It felt like 25/8. I think Trump 2.0 feels even more relentless, doesn't it? Just round-the-clock news forever. We are checking our phones to see what has happened next. And, you know, as you say, I mean, people who read my book wouldn't be surprised that Donald Trump won, wouldn't be surprised in the manner in which he is conducting his second term. But, you know, there were things that weren't on my bingo card, like, you know, Trump suggesting a US takeover of Gaza, for instance, although things like the rapprochement with Putin, which really we should look on as an act of appeasement after his aggression in Ukraine, you know, that was very easy to predict.
It's quite a sharp comment, Nick. An act of appeasement, equivalent to maybe Mr. Churchill's umbrella?
Neville Chamberlain's umbrella.
Yeah, whoops, that was a Freudian error,
right? Well, it was kind of ironic, wasn't it, that J.D. Vance made the speech that he did at the Munich Security Conference. You know, Munich was a seedbed of, you know, Nazism in the 1930s. Munich was where Neville Chamberlain, the then British Prime Minister, went and got the Munich Agreement, which was seen as this, you know, terrible act of appeasement towards Nazi Germany. And, you know, this moment feels just so historic. I mean, I would liken it to the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, I think it's that big a moment in world history at the moment. We are seeing a complete upending of the world order. Back at the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we were talking about the end of history, that famous thesis from Francis Fukuyama, which suggested that this was marking the triumph of liberal democracy. Now I'd suggest we're talking about the end of America as we have known it since the end of World War II. And, you know, you get these kind of Berlin Wall moments like Trump saying there should be a US takeover of Gaza. And since then, I think we got a couple of more Berlin Wall moments. I mean, that speech that J.D. Vance gave in Munich really kind of ruptured the transatlantic alliance, which has really been the basis of America's preeminence globally and certainly European security since the end of the Second World War. And then, of course, you've seen what's happened in Saudi Arabia with a meeting between the Russians and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, completely resetting relations between Washington and Moscow. It's almost as if the invasions of Ukraine, and there have been multiple invasions of Ukraine, have not happened. We are back to the situation during the Bush administration early on, when you remember George W. Bush sort of famously met Vladimir Putin. He looked into his soul and he gave him this sort of clean bill of health, you know, not particularly good character assessment, it has to be said. But yeah, I mean, things are just moving at a hurtling pace. And it seems at the moment, Andrew, like we're seeing the sort of tumbling of the equivalent of a Berlin Wall every couple of days.
That's quite a dramatic thing for an experienced journalist like yourself to say. You don't exaggerate unnecessarily, Nick. It's astonishing, isn't it? I mean, you didn't predict it. Nobody predicted this.
Yeah, look, I mean, that probably does sound like hyperbole to some, right? And when I first said this about 3 weeks ago, you know, I really had to think long and hard about whether the historical moments were equivalent. And, you know, 2 weeks on, I've got absolutely no doubt whatsoever. I mean, we are seeing a massive, massive change. there are European allies of America who are now not only questioning whether the United States is a reliable ally, they're questioning whether the United States is an ally at all. Some of them are even raising the possibility that some European nations like Germany, like the UK, like France, will soon be looking upon America as an adversary. And, J.D. Vance's speech was so very pointed, attacking sort of European elitism, attacking what he saw as a denial of freedom of speech in Europe by governments, but not having a single word of criticism for Vladimir Putin. I mean, at the moment, you've got this situation where people are listening to the US president and the US vice president and others like Marco Rubio with their jaws on the ground. And it's a very worrying moment for America's allies because they cannot look across the Atlantic anymore and see in the White House a president who will support them. And what they see instead is an administration that seems to be aligning itself with the kind of hard right and far right populist movements that sort of align with Trumpist thinking. And, J.D. Vance, for instance, met the leader of the AfD, the far right AfD in Germany on the sidelines of the Munich conference, and that was the week before a German election. I mean, this is a massive, massive moment in global history, and we shouldn't shy away from describing it in those terms.
The subtitle, Nick, of your book was America's Unending Conflict with Itself, the history behind Trump and J.D. Vance. But America now, and I'm talking to you from San Francisco, where obviously there aren't a lot of Trump fans or J.D. Vance fans, America seems in an odd, almost surreal way to be united. I mean, there were protests on President's Day earlier this week against Trump, calling him a tyrant. But is the thesis of your book about the forever war, America continually being divided between coastal elites and the hinterland, Republicans and Democrats, is that still manifesting itself in late February 2025?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, Trump didn't win a landslide victory in the election. He won a significant victory. He won a decisive victory. It was hugely significant, for instance, that he won the popular vote, which is obviously something he didn't manage to do in 2016, which led to this false interpretation of his victory that Trump was some kind of aberration, which is obviously, the complete opposite of what I argue in the book. I argue that Trump is as much a product of American history as Obama or Biden or Kennedy or Reagan. It's just a history that we tend to forget, the history that tends to get ignored, the history that is often concealed. But it wasn't a big win. He didn't win 50% of the popular vote, for instance. Sure, he won the 7 battleground states, and that gave the sense that it was a really massive victory, but it wasn't massive numerically at all. The divides in America are still there. I take your point that the opposition has sort of melted away at the moment. We've seen these sort of sporadic protests, but nothing really major at the moment. But, don't be fooled into thinking that America's forever wars have suddenly come to an end and Trump has won. The opposition will be back. The resistance will be back. Andrew, I remember there were moments in the Obama administration when it looked like progressives had won every battle in America. I always remember the day he went to South Carolina, the funeral of the pastor who was killed in that terrible shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. You remember the day he broke into song, he broke into Amazing Grace. It was almost for the first time in front of a black audience that he was fully embracing the mantle of America's first African-American president. He flew back to Washington that night. The White House was bathed in the rainbow colors because the Supreme Court had made same-sex marriage legal across the country. It just seemed in that moment that progressives were winning every single fight. The Supreme Court had also upheld Obamacare, the constitutionality of Obamacare. And you just kind of assume that America's first black president would be followed into office by America's first female president. There would be this kind of progress. There would be this kind of continual sense of, movement forwards. But what we were seeing in that summer of 2015 was actually the conservative backlash and the conservative fight back. We just didn't really notice it at the time. And it came in the form of Donald Trump. He literally announced his presidential bid the day before that awful Charleston shooting. And, you know, you can kind of quite easily misread history, I think. And at this moment, sure, it does look like Trump is dominant. Sure, it does look like there is this cultural shift. Sure. But don't be fooled. There'll be a kind of rearguard action for amongst progressives. And it wouldn't surprise me at all, Andrew, if in 2 years' time, you know, the Republicans, for instance, end up losing the House of Representatives in the congressional midterm elections.
When it comes to progressives, what do you make of the Democratic response, or perhaps lack of response, to the failure of Kamala Harris? The huge amount of money, the uninspiring nature of her campaign, the fiasco over Biden. Were these all accidental events, or do they speak of a broader crisis on the left amongst progressives in America?
Yeah, I think they speak of both of those things, to be honest. I mean, there were some really big mistakes made by the Democrats, not least Joe Biden's decision to contest the election as long as he did. It had become pretty clear by the beginning of 2024 that, you know, he wasn't really in a fit state to serve 4 more years. He wasn't in a fit state to see off the challenge of Donald Trump. I think there were two kind of problems for Joe Biden. He did too well at 2 critical junctures. You remember the midterm elections in 2022. I mean, many people were predicting this kind of red wave, this red tsunami. And if that had happened, I think Joe Biden would have faced a lot of pressure to step aside and for there to be a kind of orderly primary process to pick a successor. But you remember the red wave turned into a red ripple, didn't it? It just didn't eventuate. And I think that persuaded Joe Biden that he was the right guy to run. He'd focused very much on democracy. He'd put democracy on the ballot. He sort of hammered the point about January the 6th, that awful dark day in American history. And he decided to run. And I think another critical juncture was the State of the Union address at the beginning of 2024. I mean, Biden did a good job. I don't know what he had for breakfast that day, but he seemed to be on fire, right? And I think that allayed a lot of concerns in the Democratic Party as well. And I think, you know, you look back on those 2 events, and they really encouraged Joe Biden to run again. And he should never have run again. Remember, in 2020, he sort of intimated that he would be a bridge to the next generation. You know, I think he probably made a mistake back then as well as picking Kamala Harris as his vice presidential candidate, because he was basically appointing his heir. And I don't think she was the strongest Democrat to go up against Donald Trump. It was always going to be hard for a woman of color to win the Rust Belt. And that proved to be the case. And there was always this feeling that, you know, she wasn't a particularly good candidate in 2020 when she'd ran. She didn't even make it into 2020, you remember. I mean, you know, she launched the campaign pretty close to where you are in Oakland. It looked pretty good at the time, big rollout, but afterwards it became pretty clear that she was a poor candidate. And there were stronger candidates available for the Democrats, but the process of picking them at the time that Biden stepped down, there just wasn't enough time, and that process would have deeply split the party. So, you know, historical accidents, the wrong candidate, an economy that was really suffering, and an America that has always been receptive to the kind of person that Trump is. You know, all of those factors played into his victory.
So if you were giving advice to the Dems as they lick their wounds and begin to think about how to recover and fight the next battles, would you advise them to shift to the left or to the center? Yeah,
I'm not in a position to give advice to anybody on politics and on the
Dems. But you know this country as well as anyone. You spent many years covering it.
Look, I mean, I think that's a really fascinating question, because I think you could argue it flat or round, to be honest. You know, do the Democrats need to find a kind of populist of the left who can sort of win back those blue collar voters that have deserted the Democratic Party? You know, this is a historical process that's been going on for many years, Andrew. It's nothing new that working class voters are ditching the Democrats. They did this during the Reagan years. They did this during the Nixon years. Often race is part of that. Often a bad economy is part of that. Often an economy that is not working for the working class and they just can't see a way to map out an American dream for them and themselves. That is part of that. So you could argue it that you need a kind of left-wing populist, or you could argue that, and history shows this to be the case, the only way that you win the White House is as a Democrat is by being a centrist and a moderate. I mean, that was true of LBJ, that was true of Jimmy Carter, that was true of Bill Clinton. All of them were Southerners and that wasn't a coincidence. Southern Democrats came from the center of the party, the conservative side of the party, and that's part of the reason why they won. Obama was a pragmatic centrist. Kennedy wasn't the liberal of popular law. Kennedy was a very pragmatic centrist, tried to sort of bring together the warring tribes of the Democratic Party, which back then were progressives in the North and white supremacists in the South. It was this bizarre amalgam. So you could argue historically that you need to move very much to the center and to stake out that ground as Trump moves further to the right and further to the extremes. But I think, what makes it harder to say that for sure is that we are in a kind of political world right now where a lot of the old rules just don't seem to apply.
Yeah, and not only the old rules don't apply, we don't quite know what the new rules are. We don't even know if there are any rules. You've described this moment as equivalent in historic terms to the fall of the Berlin Wall or perhaps 9/11, Nick. But we've spoken so far about Ukraine, Gaza, and America's relations with the rest of the world. If we reverse the lens and look inwards, is there an equivalent historical significance? You had an interesting tweet earlier this week about Doge and the attempt in some people's eyes for a kind of capture of power by Elon Musk and the replacement of the traditional state with some sort of almost like Leninist state. What do you make of what's happening within the United States in domestic politics, particularly Musk's role?
Yeah, look, on that idea of American presidents sort of testing the bounds of the Constitution, we've been in this territory before. I mean, nobody in the modern era has done it so flagrantly as Donald Trump. But, Nixon obviously tried to sort of maximize the powers of the presidency to the extent that he broke the law. I mean, Nixon would have been impeached. Nixon would have been found guilty, I think, in a Senate trial and actually forced to leave the White House had that impeachment process gone on. Of course, he was forced to resign, basically, because the delegation of his own party drove down Pennsylvania Avenue from Capitol Hill and told him he had to go. And there was you don't get that with the modern day Republican Party with Donald Trump, of course. They've sort of fallen behind him in a way that the Republicans during the Nixon era didn't. If you go back to FDR, FDR was commonly described as an American dictator. H.L. Mencken, who was a great journalist at the time, literally wrote that America had a kind of Caesar, a pharaoh. Woodrow Wilson was really maximalist in his presidential powers. I mean, many thought he violated the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln was the great Constitution breaker. I mean, from trashing the First Amendment to exceeding his presidential powers, even in something that was good, which was to deliver the Emancipation Proclamation. That was flagrantly unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson, in buying the Louisiana Purchase, that was unconstitutional. You needed congressional approval, which he didn't have. So there's a long, long history of presidents breaking the rules. And frankly, there's a long history of Americans being okay with that. Lincoln has never been displaced from his historical throne of grace. FDR is regarded as one of the great presidents, even though many people think he did violate the Constitution. So there is a long history of presidents sort of acting beyond their powers. Again, what I think sets this moment apart is often the constraints that were eventually imposed upon presidents not only came from the courts, the Supreme Court, they often came from within their own political parties. And that's something we're not seeing at the moment with Donald Trump.
What about on the cultural front? All sorts of talk of Trump's revenge. Now he's taking over the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. He's got revenge against traditional scientists. Some people talk about him trying to close some universities down. Is this overdramatic, Nick, or in your mind, is Trump really taking revenge for what's happened over the last 4 years, between 2020 and 2024 when he was out of power?
Oh, look, I think, Trump's in a vengeful mood. I mean, no question about this. We always thought that Trump 2.0 would be a project of vengeance. And I think we're seeing that to a certain degree. We always knew that Trump would try and sort of dismantle parts of the administrative state that Republican presidents for years have always thought is working against them. And, he is dismantling the that administrative state at warp speed, you know, with Elon Musk going into various government departments and just acting like, you know, he's part of a startup that's taken a, you know, that's he's at the head of some sort of hostile takeover of the federal government. And, you know, I think we're seeing a kind of, you know, Reagan launched a rhetorical assault on the federal government, and to a certain extent, a bureaucratic assault on federal government. And this was a government that was really a creation of the New Deal years under FDR. That was the period that saw this massive expansion of the federal government and a massive expansion of the federal government into people's lives, because they created this social security system and this welfare net that still exists to this day. We haven't seen this kind of assault on the federal government since then. And that is one of the big changes. So he's assaulting the federal government, and he is trying also to dismantle what he would regard to be America's cultural establishment, which they would regard as too woke, too elitist, too kind of intellectual, all of that kind of thing. He's really trying to remold America and its government and some of its cultural institutions in his own image.
Nick, you've mentioned Reagan. I came to the US like you. You came as a grad student too to study American history. I came in the 80s. And I remember the hysteria. I came to UC Berkeley in the Bay Area, which was still is the home of progressivism in America. And there was all this hysteria over Reagan, that he was going to blow the world up, that he was clueless, that he was a Hollywood actor, that he had no right to be in politics. Is it conceivable that Trump could be just another version of Reagan in spite of all this hysteria? This second Trump regime might actually be successful?
Yeah, I mean, you can't rule out that possibility in terms of how, you know, many Americans would view it. And I think there's a parallel with Reagan. I think the mistake that was made about Reagan was that people saw him as a warmonger. And actually, Reagan really wanted to be a peacemaker. I mean, that was kind of the whole point of the end of the Cold War, really. I mean, he wanted to win the Cold War, but the way that he did it was, you know, making some gambles on people like Gorbachev, and, you know, making some diplomatic moves, which advisors warned against at the time. And in the end, he kind of turned out to be a peacemaker. And I think, you know, that's analogous to Donald Trump. I don't think he's a warmonger. I don't think he wants to send US troops into the country. I mean, he sort of described some sort of pretty sort of surprising imperial ambitions, like, you know, taking over Greenland, although he did that in the first term. And Harry Truman once wanted to do that as well, but although he didn't sort of suggest that military force could be used. And but I think ultimately, you know, Trump wants to make peace. The problem is on what terms? I mean, that is the difficulty here. You know, peace in Ukraine, in Trump's view, it looks like means a massive win for Vladimir Putin and the sidelining of the Ukrainian people and the sidelining of America's European allies who have fought that war alongside America. So, you know, I think that there wasn't a big sort of cost to Reagan's peacemaking. I mean, the European alliance stayed pretty much the same. You know, he tinkered with government, but, you know, he didn't go after Social Security. He knew that was the third rail. And, you know, he did change America to a great extent. But, you know, it's the cost of Trump, I think, that is the problem. But
the
we'll
moral
see.
cost or the economic cost?
Well, I think a moral cost, maybe an economic cost. I mean, one of the things that did happen with Reagan, if you want to kind of look at historical analysis here and historical parallels, is, you know, the Reagan era was really when you saw a kind of the big sort of disparities in income and wealth opening up in American society. And that was a big factor in Donald Trump's success. I mean, it also raises this paradox of how this billionaire from New York became the hero of the Rust Belt. But if you're looking at when income and salaries between executive pay and sort of shop floor pay became really kind of massive and a gulf opened up, it was really during the Reagan years. And you sort of see the potential for something happening now as well. Trump is sort of supercharging an economy that looks like it's going to favor the tech bros. It looks like it's going to favor the world's richest man, Elon Musk, all of that kind of stuff. And what you end up doing is actually worsening the problem that you were arguably sent there to solve. And I think that's one of the sort of paradoxes of the Trump years. But, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, you don't get landslides anymore in American politics. I mean, the last president to win 40 states was George Herbert Walker Bush. But, Reagan in 84 won 49 out of 50 states. He almost came close to getting the clean sweep of states in the Electoral College. Minnesota went for Walter Mondale, which was his home state, but only just. And the Democrats would have been left with the District of Columbia. That's all. So we will see. We will see if Trump can sort of pull off that thing. But I don't think Trump will be the kind of unifying president and that Reagan was, because there was a sunniness and there was an optimism about Reagan, and you don't see that with Trump.
Where are the divisions? Where is the great threat to Trump coming from? There was a story this week that Steve Bannon, the ultimate MAGA guy, called Elon Musk a parasitic illegal immigrant. Is it conceivable that the biggest weakness within the Trump regime is going to come from within, from conflict between guys like Bannon and Musk, the nationalist and the internationalist wing of the MAGA movement?
Oh, I think that's an absolutely fascinating question, Andrew. There doesn't seem to be much external opposition at the moment, are there? I mean, the Democrats are kind of, some people say they've been knocked out. Some people say they're sort of taking the 8 count, as you would in boxing, and sort of, getting back onto their feet and taking as long as they can to sort of get their gloves up and start punching again. But, there isn't a leader in the Democratic movement at the moment who looks like they've got anywhere near the kind of magnetism of Trump or the personal power of Trump to take him on. So where is the opposition going to come from? Maybe you're right. It sort of comes from divisions internally and a kind of internal collapse of the Trump project. I mean, this relationship with Elon Musk. I mean, something I didn't anticipate in my book, to be honest. I mean, I think if you read the book, you kind of would have had some pretty good clues about what was going to happen next. One thing I didn't anticipate was the role of Elon Musk. And
well, nobody did, not even Musk, I don't think.
No, exactly. And I mean, it was only after that assassination attempt, when Musk, an hour afterwards, endorses Trump, in a big way, and then puts his money behind him, starts offering these sort of cash prizes in Pennsylvania, things like that. And now is obviously integral to the Trump project, having lived at Mar-a-Lago basically during the transition. I mean, he literally hired a cottage on the grounds, didn't he? And now he's got a kind of office in the White House. I didn't anticipate his role, and it's fascinating to see how that dynamic, that almost this sort of co-presidency will play out. I mean, a lot of people months ago, were saying, Trump will not put up with somebody who overshadows him, who gets more attention than him, that seems more sort of captivating to the media than him, and that relationship is doomed to fail. But it hasn't failed yet. And Andrew, I wonder whether that speaks of something that is different between Trump 2.0 and 1.0. Trump's surrounded by loyalists now, but Trump's older. He's 78 years old. I think he wanted to win the presidency more than he wanted the presidency himself, to be honest. And I wonder whether he's happy to sort of give more responsibility and give more of the workload to people like Musk, who he kind of thinks are acting, carrying out his agenda. I wonder whether that will actually keep that relationship intact rather than kind of forcing a kind of big fallout.
You were described, or have been described, as the new Alistair Cooke. Alistair Cooke, of course, was the father of Anglo-American journalism. His Letter from America was an iconic show. I think the longest running show in radio history. Cooke was always very critical of what he called the big daddy state in Washington, D.C. He wasn't a fan of large government. What's your take on Trump's attack on large government in DC? Is there anything in it? You spent a lot of time in DC. These agencies, are they full of fat, Nick? Do they need to be cut?
Oh, look, I mean, cutting fat out of Washington budgets is one of the easier things, right? I mean, they're so bloated. They get all these earmarks. They're full of pork. I mean, there's always, a bloated federal bureaucracy, no question. And there's a long historical tradition that goes back to the founding. I mean, there was always this deep suspicion of Washington, which is why the federal system emerged and why so much power is vested in the states. And Reagan's revolution was very much based on sort of dismantling the New Deal government. I mean, he didn't really get that far in that project, but rhetorically speaking, he certainly shifted America's views about government. I mean, he banged on about how government was a problem, not the solution for decades. And when he became the president, you really saw this trailing off of support for government. And so much so that when Bill Clinton becomes president, he has to make this big ideological concession to Reaganism and start basically delivering Reaganite lines like the era of big government is over. You can imagine Reagan saying that, but it was actually Bill Clinton who said it. So there's a long tradition there. I think the concern right now, Andrew, is that, they're not just getting rid of the fat, they're getting rid of a lot of the expertise. And they're getting rid of a lot of the institutional knowledge, and they're getting rid of a lot of people who, may be democratic in their thinking, or maybe, not on board with the Trump revolution, but have an awful lot of experience and an awful lot of muscle memory when it comes to making government work. And, what you find is, in moments of national crisis, conservative ideologues tend to become operational liberals. They rely on government in disasters. They rely on government in pandemics. They rely in government at moments of economic crisis to bail out the banks, to bail out the auto industry. One of the things that conservatives have done very successfully over the years is to plant in the heads of many Americans that government is the enemy. There's that classic sign that Hillary Clinton encountered during 2016, where she saw this protester carrying a sign saying, get your government hands off my Medicare. Well, Medicare is a government program. So, people do need government, and people do need expertise, and people do need to know that there are people in Washington who know what they're doing. And that's the problem. You're not just getting rid of the waste, you're getting rid of that kind of institutional knowledge.
One of the more colorful characters in these Trump All-Stars is RFK Jr. There's an interesting piece in the National Review about RFK Jr. forcing the left to abandon the Kennedy legacy. Is there something symbolic historically, Nick? You're a student, longtime student of modern American history, in this shift from RFK, the father, being this icon on the left, to RFK Jr. being an icon on the libertarian right. Does it speak of something structural that's changed in American political culture?
Yeah, I really think it does. And I'd also suggest that it speaks of the change of how America is perceived internationally. I was no fan of JFK. I mean, my book, my PhD...
JFK or RFK?
JFK. Let's talk about him briefly. I mean, he's always seen as this liberal champion. As I said earlier, he was an arch pragmatist, never more so on civil rights. He's often seen as a great champion of the struggle for black equality. He really wasn't. And my doctoral thesis and my first book was sort of tearing down that myth about Kennedy. But, what I would say about Kennedy and his brother was far more stronger on civil rights than JFK. They did inspire this kind of international success. This was a time, the Kennedy White House, when it just seemed to be this place of rationality and refinement and glamour. And, JFK was seen to embody so much what was great about America, its youth, its dynamism, its kind of vision. Kennedy was obviously the guy that said, let's put a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of the 60s. And of course, they managed to do that. And, when RFK was assassinated in California, 5 or 6 weeks after the assassination of MLK, I think, many people thought that kind of America, their sense of America had been killed off too. And these were people who inspired people internationally to get involved in public service. They saw America perhaps as this beacon on a hill. RFK speaks of a very different America now. a kind of toxic American exceptionalism, where people look at figures like RFK Jr. and they think, what on earth is going on? How can it possibly be that this guy has ended up as the head of the American Health Department? It speaks of what many people internationally reject about America, whereas JFK and RFK embodied what many people loved and admired and wanted to emulate about America.
You've been very generous with your time, Nick. 2 more quick questions, and then I'll let you go to your Australian sunshine. Speaking of Australia, you do a show now on Australian television. What's the view? You've talked about the view from Europe and the Middle East. What's the view from Australia? Are people as horrified and disturbed in Australia as they are in Europe about what you've called a historic change as profound as the fall of the Berlin Wall? Maybe rather than the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's the establishment of a new kind of Berlin Wall.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the fears in Australia historically, diplomatically, is a fear of abandonment, right? I mean, they were looked upon Britain as their kind of security guarantor. In the early days of Australian Federation, as it was called, Australia became a modern day country in 1901. And they looked to Britain to protect them. And obviously after the Second World War, they couldn't do that. And during the Second War, they realized they couldn't do that. So they looked to America instead. And America has really been the kind of, has underwritten Australia's security since the Second World War. And now Australians are worried that, or a lot of Australians are worried that that's just not going to be the case anymore. Australia's entered into this big AUKUS deal, as it's called, with Britain and America, for the Americans to share their nuclear submarine technology. And that really has become the basis of Australia's defense now. And, there is this fear that, Trump could just cancel it on a whim. At the moment, they're battling over tariffs and steel and aluminium tariffs. They've got a kind of a reprieve. Briefly, Anthony Albanese is this left-wing, centre-left prime minister. He had a chat with Trump and he came away with it with this kind of a little bit of a diplomatic reprieve last week, and they're trying to focus on how to turn that into a permanent carve-out. But, a country like Australia, much like Britain, much like France, much like Germany, cannot look on Trump's America as a reliable ally right now. And that is a concern for them in a region where, China increasingly is throwing its weight around.
Although I'm guessing that some people in Australia would be encouraged by Trump's hostility towards China.
Yeah, that's one thing that sort of, they think the situation Trump and Europe is different than the situation with Trump and Asia, because there are so many China hawks in the Trump administration. That is, and a lot of the trade hawks are really sort of China trade hawks. So that does give them a measure of comfort. They don't see their situation as directly analogous to the situation in Europe, but it is a worry. They've had presidents who have been pretty favorable towards Australia over the years. And I mean, Trump, I think, kind of likes Australia, partly because America enjoys the trade surplus with Australia. He kind of likes Greg Norman, the golfer. But, that only gives you a certain measure of protection. So there is concern in this part of the world. And I think a lot of people are sort of questioning, as they are in Europe right now. I mean, alliances are based on shared values. And have we got shared values with a president who is aligning himself in Europe, at least, with far-right parties?
Finally, Nick, your penultimate book was When America Stopped Being Great, A History of the Present. You had an interesting tweet recently where you noted that the final chapter in your current book, The Forever War, is called Goodbye, America. But the more we talk, I mean, whether or not America remains great is arguable. But if anything, this conversation is about hello, a new America, isn't it? It's not goodbye, America. If anything, America's more powerful, more dominant, shaping the world more in the 2020s than it's ever done.
It's goodbye to the America that we've known for the last 70 years. But I mean, it isn't a goodbye, America, to the America that is. I think, that's one of the arguments of the book, that, Trump is far more representative of the true America than a lot of international observers realize, and a lot of observers within America realize. It goes back to this point that, you know, if you look at American history through a different lens, it makes perfect sense of Trump. You know, there's always been an authoritarian streak. There's always been a willingness to fall for a demagogue. There's always been political violence in America. There's always been this deep mistrust of government. There have always been these kind of rich people making a lot of money. You know, the robber barons of the late 19th century, the tech bros of the 21st century. You know, it's goodbye to a certain America. But the America that Trump resides over now is an America that's always been there. And I think that's the point. It's just the America that a lot of Europeans and a lot of Americans themselves probably don't want to admit is quite as strong as Trump has shown it is. I mean, it's this basic argument. You know, Trump hasn't changed America. He's revealed America.
Well, one thing I think we can say for sure is it's not goodbye to Nick Bryant. I'm going to get you back on the show if you're generous enough with your time, Nick. You're one of America's most perceptive and incisive observers, even if you're in Australia now. I'm sure you'll have another book out, but real honor, Nick, to get your take on Trump's America and this momentous shift in world history with the second Trump regime. Thank you so much.
Andrew, it's always a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on. I still love the country to bits. I mean, that's the thing. My fascination